may actually have to remove primary branches from the apex of the tree. So then, actually our secondary branches are very, very rarely interfered with. Once we've developed good secondary branching on a tree, it again very rarely gets cut away. And again, unless it dies or a tree has a period of neglect really, and maybe an area becomes far too congested because it's not been pruned correctly. But by and large, in an ideal situation, our secondary branches, which are the yellow branches on our drawing, again pretty much stay where they are for the rest of the life of the tree, with certainly a bit more adjustment than the primary branches. And the ramification. Well, the ramification is the little twigs all the way around. Now, in a way, the little twigs, I was going to say they're almost the most important part of the tree. That's silly, really, but they're certainly the crowning part of the image, because you take all the little twigs off this tree and you've basically got a skeleton. You might have a very, very nice skeleton, but actually it's all the twigs that are the piece de resistance, as poorly said. The bit that makes it look like a big mature tree. Now the interesting thing about the ramification is that it never stays the same, and there's a reason for that. This is exactly what happened last time, isn't it, really? I didn't really intend to get so much into this sort of aspect of the shaping of bonsai, but having got this far, we can hardly stop. Why have I said that actually you've got to look at the ramification as, at least in theory, being forever changeable on your tree? Bearing in mind we're talking deciduous bonsai here. We're not talking junipers and pines and spruces. We're talking about trees for which, and at some point for my guide to myself today, I've written down here, our deciduous trees, we should be working towards an image. We should always be working towards an image that looks better without leaves on it. It looks better with no leaves on it. When you're new to bonsai, that's quite a difficult concept to get through, because you think, well, the tree's leaves on, the leaves are absolutely beautiful. Oh, look, the leaves are all out in the spring, it's beautiful. Well, it's got to look beautiful with leaves on as well, but actually it should look even more beautiful when there are no leaves on, because then the viewer can see the hopefully beautiful structure of the tree that you've created over your lifetimes, and your father's lifetime, and your grandfather's lifetime. And the reason why we might think that we always need to change the ramification, not all at once, but is because this tree is going to be forever 7 inches high, or whatever it is, and with a trunk that's 1.5 inches in diameter. Now, as a consequence of those absolute givens, the volume of branches that go with this trunk is here, where my hands are. It's not here. Can you see? Can you imagine this tree with we're going to draw the exact same tree, but something a bit similar. So that's quite a reasonable, can everybody see that? That's quite a reasonable, it's not a nice drawing, I agree it's not a nice drawing, but that's, for this trunk, that's quite a reasonable balance, this harmony between the volume of that branch structure and the size of this trunk. Now, if we let this tree grow that, bit of an extreme, well, somebody can say, well, I like that better. Don't you dare to defeat that. I'll have to give up and go home if you say that. for me, there's way too much for this little trunk. This volume of branches actually needs a trunk, you know, like that, much bigger trunk, and the branches that go with it. And of course it needs a bigger pot. Does anybody disagree? So, the decisions that make this trunk like this have a very direct correlation to the volume of twigs that you can have in here. So, the tree goes on wanting to be the tallest tree in the wood, and every year we prune it back. So we've got an image in our mind, which is that. Quite clearly see that on this tree. So every year we prune it back. So we've got a nice tight little canopy of branches. They go. But that's not the end of what happens, is it? Because these branches here, we've stopped them from getting any longer, but they're scissors. What we haven't done is stop them from getting any fatter. And bearing in mind, these are the bits of the tree that are actually growing fastest. All these little young twigs. Always, the youngest part of your tree will be growing more rapidly than the rest of your tree. So these young twigs are all growing like mad. They're growing long, so we cut them back. But they're growing fat as well. And when I drew this, I was fairly careful to keep the ramification to be single strokes of the pen, more or less. Because it's that graduation from girth here near the trunk getting less and less and less and less to the fine ramification. And that's what makes a naked deciduous bonsai look really fabulous. Now, that's not just my opinion, that's almost everybody who's ever looked at bonsai over the years. That's why the Japanese have their bonsai shows in the winter when the trees don't have leaves on them. Excuse me. So, all the time our ramification is getting fatter. So we have to prune. Now, if we don't prune actually every year, basically, go back to things that we ought to go. We prune every year, given that the tree is healthy, the tree is growing vigorously, we're not worried about the roots of the tree, and so on and so forth. All these checklists of things that we go through quickly in our mind before we prune, before we repot, before we wire, before we do anything. You know, you need certain things to be in place before you can embark upon the various techniques that we do in bonsai. So all these things are given for this tree pretty much every year, and we need to look at the structure of this tree and we need to see where we can prune away ramification that is giving us the idea that it's going to be too fat. It might be already too fat, or we might think that next year it's going to be too fat. Now, the two maples that I have in my collection, I was maybe talking to Ian about it last night, very old maples, probably 60 to 80 years old each, both from Japan. Came from the same collection of bonsai in Japan, from an old guy who'd been bonsaiing a long time, but he'd got ill and he'd neglected his trees. They came to a dealer in Japan, and the wholesaler bought them, and I bought them off the wholesaler. So these trees had great nabaris, fabulous trunks, very good, by and large, very good primary branches, okay secondary branches, but the ramification was ruined, because for that section of the tree, the ramification section of the tree, the twigs were almost like the secondary branches. So the secondary branches just carried on being the ramification. And so the outside 3 to 4 inches of the tree was full of twigs that, they weren't all the same size, of course they weren't, but by and large they were all way too fat to be where they were on the tree. Now in that case, I could have said to myself, well, I'll cut a percentage of them out this year and keep some and then do it. But I decided that actually they were not trees I wanted to sell, so they didn't need to look like good enough to be sold. So what I decided to do was to cut all of the ramification off in one go and begin to develop a whole new set of ramification. So we're talking, on the trees that I'm talking about, we're talking about 3 to 4 inches of ramification on the ends of the secondary branch structure. All cut off, all in one go, and then a period of regrowing. 2 years down the road, I'm maybe not halfway to growing back the ramification. But already, I'm seeing twigs that I've grown myself that are already looking as though they might get too fat too quickly, because twigs don't all grow at the same rate everywhere on every branch. They're all being fed by a different column of vessels. Some of those columns of vessels are way more active than other columns of vessels, so the twigs are developing at different rates, even on the same tree, even on the same branch. What's a much better thing to do is not let your trees get to that stage in the first place. So every single year, or at the very least every other year, before the tree comes into leaf in the spring, and you have to do it then. No, you can't do it when the tree's full of leaves. You can't see a thing. I mean, one of the reasons I brought that maple in, the sail maple there, is because I might spend a bit of time. But you can't see anything in there to decide anything at all. So, and it's not a good idea to do it at the start of the winter when the leaves drop off in the autumn, because all of your pruning that's gone on at that period is going to sit with the tree all the way through the winter. Okay, so it's not a big deal, but it's just not the best thing to do, in my opinion. You just make the tree a little bit more vulnerable to things during the winter, having a lot of pruning activity gone on at the start of the winter. Why not wait until late winter or early spring before the tree begins to move too much with its buds, and then you can still see what you're doing, and you know that within a very short weeks of you having done all the work, the tree is going to be growing like mad, hopefully, and certainly you're going to get reparation of all the work that you've done. So maybe the best plan is to remove a percentage of the ramification every single year that is clearly getting too fat to be where it is. What percentage we could argue about? I mean, 10%, 20%, I don't know. It depends on the way you like to look at your trees. You might not be happy looking at your trees too heavily pruned, I don't know. Or you may not have time to do it properly, or you may have a mind to think, well, I'd rather do everything properly all in one go and get it done. So you might cut 20%. But it's a case of looking everywhere on the tree and seeing where already ramification is getting too big and cutting it away. Now, there's a lot of development. I'm not going to try and prune this tree perhaps as it should do. I'm looking for one place where it's quite clear to me that ramification is beginning to look like secondary branch structure. And this branch here, which is kind of cross between secondary branch structure and ramification. Can you see the branch I mean? You can see how fat that is to be right near the outside of the tree. Now the other good thing about the possibility of removing this branch is that we have a really nice, very fine branch above it. And of course, we'll get masses of buds developed. So actually, this would be a pretty good branch to remove at this stage. Now, we can develop this branch from the secondary branch structure into the new ramification to fill the space where that was. Now, that one I cut off, wherever it went, doesn't matter. If it's too fat today, if you look at it and I say to you it's too fat today, and I hope you agree with me, then next year it's going to be even much more too fat to be where it is. So there's not an awful lot of point in delaying the decision to cut it off. If you've got a fault that's a fault today, it's going to be an even bigger fault next year, and an even bigger fault than that in 5 years' time. And as painful as it sometimes is, if you want, I'm not suggesting you actually want totally fault-free bonsai, but actually you should bear in mind that if you're going to try and produce bonsai to the best of your ability and also the best result from the material that's in front of you, then sometimes taking a difficult decision today is much better than doing 5 years of work on something and saying then, oh God, yeah, that wasn't good, was it? I wish I'd cut it off now. So